Today we are going to be examining adjustments to emancipation, where the ex-slaves, the apprentices, moved from being enslaved, being apprentices, towards ruling their destiny. Now, in this section, we are going to be examining the main problems which affected the sugar industry post-emancipation. We are also going to look at the measures used to deal with the problems that were encountered. We are going to examine the impact of the immigration on the colonies. Then we're going to look at the development of free villages. We are also going to look at peasantry, how that contributed to the economy and society. And we're going to look at crown colony government and how that was adopted into the Caribbean in the 19th century. Basically, this particular part of the course examined how the ex-enslaved ruled their destiny. We recognize that the ending of apprenticeship and other transitional slave systems in the Caribbean and the coming of full freedom meant that the freed people had control over their social movement for the very first time. They also had greater bargaining power over their working conditions, and some even exercised their right to move into new communities and to bargain for better working conditions. Most of the former enslavers did their best to limit, the rights of the workers and to reduce their bargaining power. Now understand something. Emancipation didn't mean that it was going to be easy for the Africans in the Caribbean. They no longer could be punished at will, but recognize that they would be able to move around. They would be able to rule their own destinies. They would be able to provide for themselves food, clothing, shelter, tools. They would no longer be seen as property or chattel. They would be able to step out and adjust to the lives of freed people ruling their destinies. Now, the first objective is looking at the problems which existed in the sugar industry post-emancipation. I want you to remember abolition and the reasons for abolition, that there were problems that existed in the sugar industry. Remember that there was competition that existed from beet sugar. Remember the reasons why the abolitionists would have been pushing, the industrialists would have been pushing in Parliament for a change in the law related to slavery. Examine how the East Indian producers would have stepped in and how they would have tried to undercut the sale of sugar and so forth. So you would have had a situation that even before the actual emancipation of slavery occurred, there were problems existing in the sugar industry. We have here that we had increasing production costs. That was one of the first problems that existed within the sugar industry. Now, why would there be increasing production costs? The increasing production costs first came about because of mismanagement of the estates. Now, remember, we had situations where we had absentee planters existing within the whole sugar system. Absentee planters, just as a reminder, were persons who had estates and ran estates within the Caribbean, but who lived in Britain. You also had a situation where at this point in time, after emancipation, you now had to pay laborers. And obviously, now that you have a wage bill, remember before there was no wage bill, before it was slavery, before you didn't have to pay them anything because you saw them as your property. Now, with emancipation taking place, with the fact that they are no longer your property, you have to pay them if you want your estate to continue to run efficiently. So there now you have a situation where there is increasing labor costs. So your increasing labor cost now adds to your full production cost, which exists on the plantation. Number 2, you had increasing debt occurring on the estates or for many of the planters. Where was this increasing debt coming from? 1, you had a situation where planters had borrowed extensively from Britain or from British merchants, and they were unable to repay their loans because of low profits from the estates. You also had a situation where many of them continued to borrow on top of their debt. So that is what we would say increasing the debt. And then you also had where banks and merchant houses were more skeptical about giving loans to West Indian planters because there was no guarantee that those loans would have been repaid. Now, 2 examples would have been the Bank of British Guiana and the Planters Bank of Jamaica. They did not want to use estates as security for loans because there was no guarantee that they would get their money back. So this contributed to the increasing debt that occurred within the Caribbean sugar industry. Then you had labor shortages. And this is labor shortage of cheap and regular labor. Now, please remember, when we first started with the sugar industry, you had a situation where you went for the Africans because the Africans were cheap, they were plentiful, you could get many of them, and you can get them on a regular basis. But now you are having a situation where this same labor that you would have captured, that you would have kidnapped, that you would have tricked into coming into the Caribbean has been freed. And because they have been freed and you have to pay them, you have to pay them wages that you may not want to pay them. So this is the thinking of the planters. Many of them did not want to pay the ex-slaves or the ex-enslaved. They didn't want to pay them the wages that they should have paid them. So you are having a situation where, because those payments were not happening, many of the ex-slaves, especially in countries like Jamaica, British Guiana, and Trinidad to some extent, left the estate. And they decided that they were going to settle in other parts of the countries. And they also decided that they would use their skill in other areas. In some instances, too, they would have developed peasantries. And that is something that we're going to talk about later down. In developing the peasantries, they were able not only just to become self-sufficient, but they were able to create new markets for themselves. And as a result, they were able to get money and make money and provide for their families. So they were not dependent upon the estate anymore. They were not dependent upon the planters anymore. You also had some of them who would have gone into towns and they would have used the skills. So you would have the artisans using the skills that they would have gained over a period of time. So skills of carpentry and blacksmith and so forth, they would have used that in the towns. And then you had some of the Africans supplemented their income by working part-time on the plantation, and this wasn't satisfactory, unfortunately. Then you had a decline in the markets for West Indian sugar. Now, if we look at what Baldosing in Caribbean History for CSEC stated, it said since the late 17th century, the British government had imposed tariffs on sugar coming from outside of the British territories, so that the colonies were able to sell their sugar to Britain at a cheaper price, although this made sugar more expensive for British consumers. It further says, but in 1846, though, the British government started lowering this tariff or tax, and by 1854, a single duty rate was applied to all sugar of a given quality entering Britain. This meant that the sugar from the British Caribbean colonies had to compete with the cheaper sugar that was being produced in Cuba and Brazil and other parts of the world. So this came under what was known as the Sugar Equalization Act of 1846. And by 1854, it came into being. This created a major problem for many of the estates within the Caribbean region. What also came into play here is that at the same time, the mother country still tried to provide some form of protection for the Caribbean colonies. But unfortunately, they were not successful with regards to that. In doing this, they were able to help them temporarily. Let's turn our attention to the solutions that existed. One of the first problems was labor. So the first solution to this was alternative labor sources. So this is where we are going to be talking about immigration as we go a little further down in the theme. So we're going to come back to alternative sources of labor. Then you had mechanization of production, and I'm going to also add new techniques that they would have used. So when we look at mechanization of production, we are talking about moving from using the animals to using steam. We are talking about new equipment which was brought in, equipment such as vacuum pans. And the vacuum pan basically is a device which would allow for more cane syrup to turn into crystals and produce a higher proportion of sugar. And the first vacuum pan would have come in just before Emancipation in 1833. There was also a centrifuge that was also brought in, and that also helped with producing a higher proportion of sugar. Then you had new techniques, because remember I said we can combine your mechanism of the production with the new techniques. So we talk about new techniques being developed. They started to use the plow and the harrow. Remember, before it would have been the slaves who would have been in the field working and trying to dig out the holes and trying to take out the weeds and so forth. Now what they're doing, new techniques, the plow and the harrow. They introduced different types of fertilizers. They also brought in irrigation schemes, and they also implemented proper drainage systems. And all of this was supposed to help with the production of the sugar cane. They also introduced new varieties of cane. So obviously you're trying to get a higher sugar content. All right. And you're trying to get a higher sugar content, a higher quality of sugar so that you'll be able to compete better on the market. So that is why they try to find new varieties of cane so that the sugar content that they would get from the cane would be higher. They started to amalgamate estates. Now, remember I mentioned before that the estates were in debt. And because the estates were in debt, you would not have been able to effectively get a loan for any of these mechanization of production or the new varieties or anything of the sort that you would have needed a loan for. As a small estate, you would not have been able to get it. So what ended up happening was that the small estates came together as a large estate. And as they come together as a large estate, it would be for efficiency. It would be for less factory equipment. It would be for better management. And last but not least, it would be so that I would be able to go to the bank and say, okay, this is what we can produce. Can I have a loan to help me to do X, Y, or Z? Now, you also would have had a case. Now, if I amalgamate the estates, it means that I have more land to cultivate, which is a good thing. Now, the next one is the establishment of new markets. Britain is the market that you're dealing with. Yes, you had mercantilism before, but now you are having a situation where you want to establish new connections. And the new connection that they thought of establishing would have been with the US. They felt that it would have been better to establish markets with the US so that they would not have had the same competition. So basically what they would have done is approach the US to see whether or not they would be able to use that particular market. Then we look to technical advice. The technical advice, many of the colonial governments employed skilled engineers to give advice to the planters. For example, you had new types of manufacturing techniques which would save costs. So that was something that the engineers would have come in and would have spoken to them about. We talked earlier about the vacuum pans and the centrifuge. That would have also saved costs. So those are two things that they would have done. The departments of agriculture, those were established by some of the governments within the Caribbean. And these departments gave advice to the sugarcane farmers and offered technical assistance and financial advice on increasing the production of the sugar. The government departments also conducted research on new types of crop, which would help with the introduction of the new variety of canes. So this would bring to the end now the problems that existed and the solution to the problems that were presented. So what I want you to remember is your problems, increasing production costs, and this was because of mismanagement of the estate, increasing debt, again, because you were piling on debt more and more, labor shortages, cheap, regular labor, you didn't want what was there, and therefore you looked to other places for them, a decline in the sugar market because of competition. The 1846 Sugar Equalization Act is something that I want you to always remember because it really, really had an impact on the Caribbean sugar industry. The solutions presented would have been your alternative labor sources, mechanization of production, new varieties of cane, amalgamation of the estates, establishment of the new markets, technical advice. Now, as we would have said before, the ending of apprenticeship would have provided the enslaved with a form of ruling their destiny. They did not have to deal with the problems of the sugar industry. They were not necessarily a part of the solutions presented, but they found a way to rule their own destinies as time went by. And that is something that we are going to explore in the coming weeks.